Africa is a big place with a lot of history, but is treated as a single entity in modern political discussions. Before going over the charts, consider this. In 1950, the continent of Africa, including North Africa, had a population of 230 million. In 2015, that number had increased to 1,166 million, or 1.166 billion. This is a quintupling of the population. Is Europe directly responsible for that? Did they pay Africans to overbreed? This, the most important factor in Africa's standard of living, is simply never mentioned. That aside, first let's look at the purchasing power parity per capita in Africa by year and see if colonization corresponds to any major shifts. Looking at this, the answer seems to be no. There's nothing that really immediately pops out at you. Contrary to either narrative, it seems colonialism neither helped nor hurt. Also, that Africa didn't really get any poorer overall following decolonization. I think colonialism is a big thing politically, basically the whole world being painted a few European colors, but this may overstate how important it was economically. The next chart compares Africa to China, India, and Japan over the same years. At first, I was going to fix the scale and just blow up the differences between India, China, and Africa, but I like the perspective that this gives. Another thing that calls into question the impact of colonialism is when we look at the variation between former colonies after 1960. So first, let's look at the nominal GDP per capita of South Korea, Zimbabwe, and Botswana between 1960 and 1975. They're all super poor. Now, Korea was not a European colony, of course, but it's important to know that in 1960, East Asia, including China, as seen previously, was every bit as poor as Africa. Following 1975, the trajectory changes. Zimbabwe doesn't have statistics for a few years, but I think we can piece together what's in there. Is colonialism responsible for Zimbabwe being poor, but slightly less so for Botswana? Right, because Botswana started to have major economic growth around 1985. We can also break this down country by country and ask whether nations that were more colonized ended up being poorer or richer. The answer, whether you measure colonization by the number of Europeans who went there or the amount of time that a colony lasted there, is that the more colonized nations ended up being richer. Now, you might say that this is all because more Europeans went to and stayed longer at richer African countries. You can say that, but you would need evidence for that. And that evidence would need to take into account the fact that the amount of precious metals in an area does not predict the degree to which it was colonized by Europeans. The pro-colonialism case is strengthened further by the fact that the degree to which an area was colonized also predicts its future quality of education and government quality, and these variables moderate the relationship between colonization and modern wealth. So there's little systematic evidence that colonialism made Africa poor. What little evidence there is suggests the opposite. But the Europeans as colonial exploiters has another end of the equation, where all of this exploitation went to. If the colonizers are exploiting all of this wealth, well then there should be some wealth at the other end of the tunnel here. I took the population of a country in 1940 and the population of their empires in 1940, and the population of the empire divided by the population of the country is the colonization index. An index of 1 would mean that there was one colonial subject for every citizen. The British Empire, at 10.46, had 10.46 colonial subjects for every British citizen. I then compared their per capita GDPs in 1970, 30 years later, and I chose 1970 because that was the earliest year that West Germany appeared on the Wikipedia list of historical nominal per capita GDPs. The countries I chose to compare to were all non-communist European countries. Communist being defined as the USSR, the Warsaw Pact, or being Yugoslavia or Albania. If you included communist countries, sure, you would find that colonizers, being all non-communist, would be wealthier than the average of all European countries, but they're not wealthier than other non-communist European countries. Now, exactly how much wealth one could extract from a dirt-poor African, if indeed that's what these countries were doing, seems intuitively like it wouldn't be worth the effort. Germany, with no empire, was able to drop France, Britain, and Belgium and Holland combined in World War II. And in World War I, Germany was almost able to knock out Belgium and France, saved only by the British outside Paris. Now, in World War II, it was a matter of military strategy, not necessarily industrial power, but even in 1939, Germany could produce more of any military equipment than France and any non-naval military equipment than Britain. And Germany had few colonies in its history relative to its size, and none since 1918. Otto von Bismarck certainly thought colonies were a waste. And at the year 2013, the story is the same regarding the colonization index and per capita GDP. So it's not like the benefits of colonialism kicked in later. There's still no relationship between colonialism and wealth for European countries, and one of the colonizers, Portugal, is even starting to fall behind some former communist countries. We can briefly compare the per capita GDP of sub-Saharan Africa to two racially African countries that were independent since at least 1804, Haiti and Ethiopia. Haiti achieved its independence from France in 1804, and 209 years later is as poor as the continent of Africa. Haiti is the smaller of the two countries on the island of Hispaniola. The Dominican Republic is on the same island as Haiti, but is not a racially African majority. Jamaica is a racially African island country in the Caribbean that remained under British rule until 1962. Ethiopia evaded any European rule except by Mussolini's Italy from 1936 to 1942. Ethiopia's war with Italy and their liberation by Britain killed 290,000 Ethiopians out of a population of 17.7 million, or 1.6% of the Ethiopian population. By comparison, during World War II, Japan lost 4.1% of its population, Germany lost 10.46% of its population, Yugoslavia lost 8.8%, the Soviet Union lost 16%, Romania lost 3.1%, and Poland lost 17%. Italy lost 1%, France lost 1.4%, and the United Kingdom lost 0.9% of its population in World War II. To blame Ethiopia's current economic issues on the effects of World War II 72 years later would betray a great ignorance about the history of other countries. One country I forgot to add to that list was Liberia. Liberia became formally independent from the United States in 1847, though was arguably functionally independent in 1822. Despite its independence, Liberia's per capita GDP is $886, $878, or $900 according to the IMF, the World Bank, or the CIA, respectively. And these numbers are well below the sub-Saharan African average. Within Africa, by far the most colonized country was South Africa, in terms of proportion of the population that was European, length of formal and effective European rule, and economic impact of the European interventions. If colonization impoverished the colonized African people, then we should expect the blacks in South Africa to be especially poor compared to the blacks in the rest of Africa, but we don't see that at all. South African blacks are well above the average for blacks in Africa. In fact, about 3 times as high. To recap, 1. White colonizing countries were no wealthier than non-colonizing white countries, so long as they weren't communists. None of the colonizing white countries were communist. The colonial exploiter narrative should predict that the colonizing countries should be wealthier than the non-colonizing white countries that weren't communist. This is not the case. 2. Black countries that entirely, in the case of Haiti and Liberia, or almost entirely, in the case of Ethiopia, escaped colonization were no better off than the rest of Africa. 3. The blacks in the most colonized African country, South Africa, are over 3 times as wealthy per capita as blacks in the less colonized African countries. This is not to justify colonialism and the denial of sovereignty that conquest makes. It is merely to say that the whites exploited Africa narrative is probably false.